I knew my marriage was over the moment my wife said her ex should spend Christmas with us. She didn't say it like it was strange or complicated. She said it the way someone suggests adding an extra chair at the table. Casual. Reasonable. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. We were standing in the kitchen when it happened, the smell of cinnamon candles and roasted turkey already filling the house, because Melissa loved decorating early for the holidays. The lights were up on the porch, the tree was glowing in the living room, and snow had started dusting the street outside our quiet suburban block just outside Columbus. On the surface, everything looked like the kind of life people put on Christmas cards. But the moment she said his name, something in my chest went still. Ryan. Her ex-boyfriend from years before we met. She leaned against the kitchen counter scrolling through her phone when she said it. Ryan doesn't really have anyone this year, she told me, like she was explaining something obvious. His parents moved to Arizona and his sister's overseas. I was thinking, maybe he could spend Christmas with us. I remember standing there holding a mug of coffee, watching the steam curl into the air. I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't hear her. Because I heard it too clearly. The words landed in the room and just hung there between us. Melissa looked up at me after a moment, waiting for some kind of reaction, but her expression wasn't nervous or uncertain. It was calm, almost confident, like she had already decided what the answer should be. That was the moment I understood something I hadn't been willing to admit before. In her mind, this wasn't crossing a line. In her mind, it was perfectly reasonable. It's just Christmas dinner, she added with a small shrug. It's not a big deal. Maybe that was the part that hurt the most. Not the invitation itself. The way she said it, like my feelings were an afterthought. Like my presence in that decision wasn't necessary. I took a slow sip of coffee and set the mug down on the counter. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft music playing from the living room where she had a holiday playlist running. Bing Crosby, singing about snow. I looked at the lights on the tree through the doorway and then back at my wife. Melissa had always been the kind of person who believed she could keep every door open in her life. Old friends, old memories, old relationships. She called it staying connected. I used to call it being kind. But standing there in that kitchen, hearing her talk about inviting the man she once loved into our home for Christmas, something shifted inside me. Not anger, not even jealousy, just a quiet realization settling into place like the final piece of a puzzle you wish you never started. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply nodded once and said, "If that's what you want." Melissa smiled like the problem had already been solved. She went back to scrolling through her phone, probably texting him the invitation right there in front of me. And that was the strange thing about the moment my marriage began to end. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt quiet. Ordinary. Just a man standing in his own kitchen realizing that the life he built might not belong to him the way he thought it did. Ryan arrived 3 days before Christmas. Melissa told me that detail the same way someone announces a delivery time for a package, cheerful and efficient, like everything was already settled. I was in the garage when she said it, standing beside my old pickup truck with the hood open, wiping grease from my hands with a shop towel. The cold air smelled like snow and pine from the trees lining our street. She stepped out onto the driveway wearing one of those thick winter sweaters she loved, the kind with red stitching and little white snowflakes across the shoulders. "Ryan's flight lands Thursday afternoon," she said. I told him he could stay in the guest room. She said it casually, like the guest room was simply a spare chair waiting to be filled. I nodded slowly and closed the hood of the truck. The metal latch clicked louder than it should have. Our house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, the kind of neighborhood where every porch had wreaths on the doors and inflatable snowmen on the lawns this time of year. I had spent the previous Saturday climbing a ladder in 30-degree weather hanging. White lights along the gutters because Melissa liked when the house looked festive from the street. I stood there in the driveway looking at those lights now, glowing faint even in the gray afternoon sky. "That was quick," I said. Melissa shrugged. "Flights fill up around Christmas." He booked early. Then she smiled, like she had just solved a small logistical problem. I watched her walk back inside the house and close the door behind her. For a long time I stayed there in the driveway listening to the quiet hum of distant traffic from the highway a mile away. The cold wind moved through the trees, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke from someone's fireplace down the block. That night Melissa talked about Ryan more than she realized. It happened in small pieces scattered through ordinary conversation. While we were eating dinner, she mentioned that he had started his own outdoor equipment company out west. Later, while she wrapped gifts at the dining room table, she laughed about how Ryan used to drive 3 hours just to hike a mountain trail on a random Saturday. I noticed how her voice changed when she said his name. Not louder, not dramatic, just lighter, like someone remembering a song they had not heard in years. I listened quietly and nodded when it felt necessary. 20 minutes later, she asked me if we had extra blankets for the guest room. I told her there were 2 in the hall closet. She thanked me and carried them upstairs, humming along to the Christmas music still playing through the speakers in the living room. When she disappeared down the hallway, I sat alone at the table staring at the half-wrapped gifts in front of me. Red paper, gold ribbon, our last name written carefully on each tag in Melissa's neat handwriting. I realized something strange in that moment. Melissa was excited. Not in a way she would ever admit out loud, but it was there in the way she moved around the house that night, checking the guest room, adjusting the decorations, planning the grocery list for Christmas dinner. The house felt different already, like something from the past had quietly stepped through the front door before Ryan even arrived. And as I sat there listening to the music and the distant sound of Melissa moving upstairs, I understood something else too. The invitation had not just been about Christmas. It had been about making space for someone who used to belong here. Ryan arrived on Thursday exactly when Melissa said he would. I remember the time because I looked at the clock when the doorbell rang. 3:47 in the afternoon. The sky outside had already turned that pale winter gray that comes before sunset in December. I was in the living room pretending to read an email on my laptop when Melissa rushed past me toward the front door with a kind of energy I had not seen in a while. She opened it before the second ring. Cold air swept into the hallway along with the faint smell of airport terminals and winter jackets. Ryan stood there with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a wide grin like he had just stepped into a familiar place. He was taller than I expected, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark flannel jacket and boots that still had a little snow on them from the sidewalk. "Melissa," he said with a laugh that filled the doorway. She stepped forward and hugged him quickly, the kind of hug that lasts just a second longer than polite. Then she turned and gestured toward me. "Daniel, you remember Ryan." I stood up and walked over slowly, extending my hand. Ryan shook it firmly, smiling like we were old friends who had simply not seen each other in years. "Man, it is good to finally meet you," he said. "Melissa has told me a lot about you." I nodded once. "All good things, I hope." He laughed easily. "Only the boring, responsible ones." Melissa laughed with him and closed the door behind us, shutting out the cold evening air. For the next hour the house filled with the sounds of small talk and movement. Ryan carried his bag upstairs to the guest room, while Melissa showed him where everything was. I stayed in the kitchen, rinsing dishes that were already clean just to give my hands something to do. From upstairs I could hear their voices drifting down the hallway, sometimes clear, sometimes muffled. They were talking about old college friends, about road trips from years ago, about places they used to go hiking together. Every few minutes Melissa's laughter echoed through the house, bright and effortless. I had not heard that exact laugh in a long time. When they finally came back downstairs, Ryan stood in the living room looking at the Christmas tree like he had walked into a postcard. "This place is beautiful," he said. Melissa smiled proudly. "Daniel did the lights outside last weekend." Ryan looked at me and gave an approving nod. "Man, that must have taken hours in this cold." I shrugged lightly. A ladder and patience can solve a lot of problems. We ordered pizza that night instead of cooking. 3 boxes sat open on the coffee table while a football game played quietly on the television. The scene looked normal from the outside. 3 adults sitting around a living room decorated with stockings and garland, eating dinner and talking about travel and work. But the longer the evening went on, the more I noticed something subtle happening between them. Ryan and Melissa spoke a kind of shared language built from memories I had never been part of. Old stories would surface in the middle of conversation, and they would look at each other and laugh before finishing the sentence. I listened and nodded when it felt appropriate, but there were moments when the room felt like it had quietly shifted around me. Not hostile, not uncomfortable, just slightly out of alignment, like furniture moved an inch to the left when no one was looking. By the time the game ended and Ryan headed upstairs for the night, Melissa was still smiling in that light, effortless way. She stood in the hallway watching him climb the steps before finally turning back toward the living room. When her eyes met mine across the glow of the Christmas lights, She looked happy. And for the first time since the invitation had been spoken in our kitchen, I understood something with absolute clarity. Ryan was not visiting a house. He was walking back into a chapter of Melissa's life that had never completely closed. The next morning the house smelled like coffee and cinnamon rolls because Melissa always believed holidays should begin slowly. Sunlight crept through the living room windows and caught the ornaments on the tree, turning the entire room into a quiet shimmer of red and gold. I woke up early out of habit and stood at the kitchen counter pouring a second cup of coffee while the house was still quiet. Outside the street looked frozen in. That calm December stillness, snow resting along the edges of driveways and rooftops like a blanket pulled over the neighborhood. For a few minutes it almost felt normal again. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs and Ryan's voice drifted into the hallway, followed by Melissa laughing softly. They came into the kitchen together talking about the cold air outside and how the snow reminded Ryan of hiking trips he used to take out in Colorado. Melissa handed him a mug and leaned against the counter beside him like they had been sharing mornings in that kitchen for years. I stood there across from them, listening to the easy rhythm of their conversation. Ryan told stories about sleeping in mountain cabins and waking up before sunrise to watch the sky turn orange over the peaks. Melissa listened with a kind of quiet attention that I recognized immediately. It was the same look she used to give me years earlier when we first moved into this house and talked about our future over cheap takeout dinners. Ryan laughed halfway through one of his stories and said he had always admired people who could build a calm life like this, pointing toward the tree, the lights, the quiet neighborhood outside the window. Melissa glanced toward me and smiled politely. "Daniel built most of it," she said. Ryan nodded and took a sip of coffee. "Well, it looks like the kind of place people work their whole lives to get." I shrugged lightly and said something about steady jobs and 30-year mortgages. The conversation moved on, but the air in the room felt subtly different now, like something invisible had shifted overnight. Throughout the morning, Melissa kept finding reasons to include Ryan in small parts of the day. When she went outside to brush the snow off the porch railing, he followed her. When she drove to the grocery store for last-minute Christmas supplies, he offered to come along and help carry bags. I stayed behind to finish wrapping presents, sitting alone at the dining room table while Christmas music played softly from the speakers in the living room. I wrapped the box slowly and tied the ribbon carefully, listening to the quiet house around me. At some point, I realized the silence felt heavier than it had before Ryan arrived. Not because anyone was doing something wrong, but because the balance of the room had changed in a way that was impossible to ignore. Later that afternoon, Melissa and Ryan returned from the store laughing about something that had happened in the parking lot. Snow clung to Ryan's jacket and Melissa's cheeks were pink from the cold. They carried grocery bags into the kitchen and began unpacking them together while talking over each other about recipes and holiday traditions. I stood there watching them for a moment before stepping forward to help. Ryan handed me a bag filled with canned goods and said with an easy smile that he hoped he was not disrupting our holiday. I told him he was our guest and guests were always welcome. He nodded gratefully and continued helping Melissa sort the groceries on the counter. The scene looked warm and ordinary under the glow of the kitchen lights. But somewhere deep in the quiet part of my mind a thought had already settled into place. This house used to feel like a story Melissa and I were writing together. Now it felt like a place where someone had opened an old chapter and begun reading it out loud again. Christmas Eve arrived with a quiet kind of brightness that made the entire neighborhood look like something from an old holiday movie. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, soft and powdery, covering the lawns and sidewalks until every house on the street looked like it had been carefully placed inside a winter postcard. I woke before the others again, moving quietly through the house with a cup of coffee while the sky outside slowly turned from dark blue to pale gray. The Christmas tree lights were still glowing in the living room, reflecting off the ornaments in small golden flashes that moved when I passed by. For a few minutes the house belonged to the quiet again, the way it used to before life became complicated. Then footsteps sounded on the stairs, and Melissa appeared wrapped in a thick robe, her hair still loose from sleep. She smiled when she saw the tree and whispered something about how beautiful it looked in the early morning light. A moment later Ryan came down behind her, stretching his arms like someone waking up in a place that already felt familiar. Melissa laughed when he complained about the cold floors upstairs and told him she should have warned him. About Ohio winters. I watched them from the kitchen doorway while they talked, noticing how easily the space between them filled with conversation. Ryan offered to help prepare dinner that evening, and Melissa seemed genuinely pleased by the idea. The two of them began talking about recipes and side dishes while I stood quietly rinsing a mug in the sink. It was not anything dramatic or inappropriate, just the simple rhythm of two people remembering old habits around each other. Throughout the day, the house stayed busy with the small traditions Melissa loved. She baked cookies while Christmas music played softly from the speakers. Ryan helped hang a fresh wreath on the front door after the wind knocked the old one loose. At one point, the two of them stood in the driveway brushing snow from Ryan's rental car, and I could hear them laughing through the open window above the sink. The sound carried easily across the cold air. Later that afternoon, we sat in the living room watching a holiday movie while the smell of roasting turkey filled the house. The tree lights flickered gently in the corner, and outside the street lamps began to glow as evening settled over the neighborhood. Ryan told a story about getting lost on a hiking trail during a snowstorm years ago, and Melissa laughed so hard she had to wipe tears from her eyes. I smiled politely when they looked toward me, but inside something had already begun to settle into place. Not anger, not even disappointment, just clarity. I realized that the person Melissa used to be with Ryan was someone I had not seen in a very long time. The version of her sitting on that couch felt lighter, younger somehow, like a photograph pulled from the past and placed gently into the present. And as I watched them talking under the glow of the Christmas lights, I understood something that had been slowly forming in the quiet corners of my mind since the moment Ryan arrived. Some people do not return to your life by accident. Sometimes they return because a part of the story was never fully finished in the first place. Christmas night settled over the house slowly, the way winter evenings often do, quiet and almost gentle. Outside, the neighborhood looked peaceful under the streetlights, snow reflecting a soft glow across the empty sidewalks. Inside our living room, the tree lights shimmered against the dark windows while the last of the dishes dried on the rack beside the sink. Dinner had gone exactly the way Melissa hoped it would. The turkey was perfect, the table was full, and Ryan had complimented nearly every dish she made. The three of us had sat there for nearly 2 hours talking about travel, work, and memories that seemed to drift naturally back to places Ryan and Melissa had once shared. I noticed how easily she leaned into those stories, how quickly she filled in details he forgot. When they talked about an old road trip through Utah, she remembered the exact diner where they stopped for pie after midnight. When he mentioned a lake they used to hike near, she laughed and reminded him about the time he slipped on wet rocks and soaked both of their backpacks. They looked at each other the way people do when they share a private map of the past. I listened and nodded when they looked toward me, adding a comment here and there about work or the neighborhood or the way Ohio winters never seem to end. But somewhere between dessert and coffee, something inside me finally became clear. It happened quietly, the way most important realizations do. Ryan was telling another story, something about camping under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone spilled salt across black glass. Melissa was listening with that same bright attention I had noticed all weekend. And suddenly I understood that I had been trying to compete with something that was not actually happening in the present. What existed between them was not new. It was memory, a version of life that lived in stories and laughter and the feeling of being young again. I set my coffee cup down slowly and looked around the room we had spent years building together. The tree in the corner, the stockings above the fireplace, the quiet street beyond the window where I had shoveled snow every winter since we bought the house. None of it felt less real. But something about the way Melissa looked at Ryan told me that part of her heart still lived somewhere outside this room. After dinner, Ryan offered to wash dishes, and Melissa happily accepted the help. The two of them stood at the sink talking while I carried empty plates from the table. Their voices blended together with the sound of running water and clinking glass. It looked like a scene from a holiday movie, warm and ordinary and peaceful. But for the first time since Ryan arrived, I no longer felt like an outsider watching something that did not belong to me. Instead, I felt something much simpler. Calm. The kind of calm that comes when a question you have been avoiding finally answers itself. Later that night, Melissa and Ryan sat in the living room, finishing a second cup of coffee, while a quiet jazz version of a Christmas song played through the speakers. I stood near the window looking out at the snow-covered street, and realized that sometimes the hardest part of a story is not anger or betrayal. Sometimes it is simply recognizing when a chapter has already ended, even if no one has said the words out loud yet. The house grew quiet after midnight. The kind of silence that only comes after a long holiday day finally runs out of energy. Ryan went upstairs first, saying he was still adjusting to the time change from traveling. Melissa stayed in the living room a little longer, sitting on the couch with her legs tucked under a blanket while the Christmas tree lights flickered softly across the walls. I stood in the kitchen rinsing the last coffee mug and listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. When I finished, I dried my hands slowly and walked into the living room. Melissa looked up at me with a relaxed smile. "Today was nice," she said quietly. It felt like old times. The words hung in the room for a moment. I knew she meant the holiday itself, the decorations, the laughter, the warmth of the house. But something about the way she said it made the sentence feel heavier than she realized. I nodded once and looked toward the tree. The lights reflected in the window behind it, doubling the glow against the dark winter night outside. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Melissa stood and stretched her arms lightly. "I think I am going to head upstairs," she said. "Tomorrow we can show Ryan the park by the river. The trails are beautiful in the snow." I told her that sounded like a good plan. She walked toward the staircase and paused halfway up, glancing back at the living room as if memorizing the quiet moment. Then she disappeared into the hallway upstairs. The house settled again after that. I turned off the living room lamp and stood there for a while looking at the tree. The ornaments Melissa had collected over the years hung in neat rows across the branches. Small glass houses, little silver bells, a wooden star from the first Christmas after we bought the house. Each one held a memory from a life we had built piece by piece. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. The snow on the road reflected the pale glow of the streetlights, turning the entire neighborhood into a quiet silver landscape. Somewhere in the distance a car passed slowly, tires crunching through the snow. I stood there for a long time thinking about how strange it was that clarity can arrive in the middle of something that looks perfectly peaceful. Nothing dramatic had happened in our house that day. No arguments. No accusations. Just stories, laughter, and the return of someone from Melissa's past. But sometimes that is all it takes to reveal what was already true beneath the surface. I turned off the tree lights one by one until the room fell into darkness. Upstairs I could hear faint movement from the hallway, the quiet sound of footsteps and a door closing softly. For a moment, I rested my hand on the back of the couch and looked around the living room one last time that night. The furniture, the decorations, the warmth of the house all looked exactly the same as they had the day before. Yet something inside me had shifted in a way that could not be undone. As I walked toward the stairs, I realized that the calm I felt earlier had grown stronger. Not sadness, not anger, just the quiet understanding that when the new year arrived in a few days, my life would not look the same as it did now. The days after Christmas moved slowly, like the quiet stretch of winter that settles between holidays when the decorations are still up, but the excitement has already faded. Ryan stayed longer than I expected. At first it made sense. Snowstorms delayed a few flights across the Midwest, and the airport outside Columbus was backed up for 2 days. Melissa said it would be easier if he just waited until the weekend to travel. Ryan agreed easily and settled into the rhythm of the house as if he had always been part of it. Mornings started with coffee in the kitchen while pale winter sunlight spread across the counters. Some afternoons Melissa and Ryan drove into town to pick up groceries or walk through the small park by the frozen river. I stayed home more often, catching up on work emails and small projects around the house. None of it felt dramatic. In fact, everything looked surprisingly normal from the outside. 3 people sharing meals, watching movies, talking about plans for the coming year. But something quiet had already changed inside me, and once that clarity appeared it was impossible to ignore. I began noticing details that had probably existed long before Ryan arrived. The way Melissa listened when he spoke about his life out west. The way her laughter came faster when the conversation drifted toward the years before we met. It was never inappropriate or openly romantic. It was simply familiarity, the kind that belongs to people who once imagined a future together and never fully stopped remembering it. One afternoon near the end of the week, I sat alone in my home office while the two of them talked in the living room. Their voices carried faintly through the hallway, while snow fell quietly outside the window. I listened without meaning to. Ryan was telling her that he had almost moved back to Ohio a year earlier, but decided against it because he thought there was nothing left for him here. Melissa was quiet for a moment before answering softly that life had a strange way of circling people back to places they thought they had already left behind. The sentence was simple, but something about the tone stayed with me long after the conversation moved on. That evening I took a walk through the neighborhood after dinner. The air was cold enough to make each breath visible, and the streetlights reflected off the snow like scattered glass. As I walked past the rows of quiet houses, I realized the calm I had felt since Christmas night had grown stronger with each passing day. It was no longer confusion or uncertainty. It was direction. When I returned home, the living room lights were on, and Melissa and Ryan were sitting on opposite ends of the couch talking about New Year's plans. Melissa looked up and smiled when I stepped inside, asking if the cold air felt refreshing. I told her it did. Then I glanced at the calendar hanging near the kitchen doorway. Only 4 days remained before the new year arrived. For a moment, I stood there looking at the dates while their conversation continued quietly behind me. And in that simple moment, the decision that had been forming since Christmas finally settled completely into place. New Year's Eve arrived quietly, the way the end of a long winter week sometimes does when the excitement has already been spent. Snow still covered the neighborhood in a pale blanket, and the sky stayed gray for most of the afternoon. Inside the house, the Christmas decorations were still up, though the lights on the tree no longer felt like celebration. They felt like the final glow of something that had already passed. Ryan spent the morning packing his bag in the guest room because his flight out of Columbus was finally confirmed for the evening. Melissa moved around the house slowly, folding blankets, tidying the kitchen, doing small things that kept her hands busy. The three of us ate a quiet lunch at the dining table, while a football game murmured from the television in the next room. Conversation stayed light and ordinary, the way people speak when everyone senses a change, but no one says it out loud. Around 3 in the afternoon, I went upstairs and opened the closet in the hallway. My suitcase sat on the top shelf exactly where it had been since our last vacation 2 years earlier. I brought it down without making noise and carried it into my home office. The room smelled faintly of wood polish and paper, the same quiet place where I had worked for years. Packing did not take long. A few shirts, some documents, my laptop, and the folder with papers I had quietly arranged earlier that week. When I finished, I closed the suitcase and looked around the room for a moment, letting the silence settle. Downstairs, I could hear Melissa and Ryan talking in the living room, while the late afternoon light faded outside. By the time evening arrived, Ryan's ride to the airport pulled into the driveway. I helped him carry his bag to the car. The cold air outside bit through my jacket, but the sky had cleared enough for a pale sunset to glow across the snow-covered roofs. Ryan shook my hand firmly and thanked me again for letting him stay. I told him it was not a problem and wished him a safe flight. Melissa hugged him before he climbed into the car, standing there for a moment as the engine started and the headlights swept across the driveway. When the car finally disappeared at the end of the street, the neighborhood fell quiet again. Melissa stayed outside for a moment longer before turning back toward the house. When she walked into the living room, she stopped. My suitcase stood beside the couch. The Christmas tree lights reflected softly off the window behind it. She looked from the suitcase to me, with confusion slowly spreading across her face. "Daniel, what is this?" she asked quietly. I rested my hand on the handle of the suitcase and spoke calmly. I told her that sometimes it takes a moment like this to understand where a person truly belongs. I told her that inviting Ryan into the house did not break our marriage, but it revealed something that had already been fading for a long time. Melissa shook her head slightly, trying to find words, but I could see the realization beginning to form in her eyes. I explained that I had accepted a position in another city starting after the new year, and that the papers on the kitchen table would make the rest of the transition clear. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the heater pushing warm air through the vents. Outside, a few distant fireworks began popping somewhere across the city as people celebrated the coming year. Melissa stood there looking at the suitcase, the quiet house, and the life that had slowly slipped out of reach without her noticing. And as midnight approached, the new year arrived exactly the way clarity often does in life. Quietly, and far too late for someone to change what they had already lost.